Hello everyone. Having technical issues today. So hit that like button. Please hit that like button and put a comment, put one of your questions in the chat box. So, heck of a day. What a big day for many people. So we're going to talk about the Supreme Court's decision on abortion today, and I'm going to go through some of the highlights of the decision and also the dissent. It's pretty interesting. There's a lot of things in there that I think are quite interesting. So please do hit that like button, hit the bell notification and the chat, put a question in the chat. So not only is it a big day for the Supreme Court and for the citizens of the United States, but it's also a big day for O.J. Simpson. And did you know that Ron Goldman's father is asking the court to review the judgment in the case, in the civil case, where O.J. Simpson was found liable for $33.5 million in damages. So Ron Goldman's father wants the court to review it and to have the judgment be $96 million, not $33 million, because it's $33 million plus the interest. Okay, so I'm just chatting away here. So, okay, let's talk about this historic day today. So, I'm just analyzing. I'm not taking a position one way or another. And hi there, I'm Michele Hagan. I'm a legal analyst and an attorney, former prosecutor, and I'm also a former prosecutor of domestic violence and child abuse. So, having that in mind, I am just analyzing the decision and just explaining what I see as the rationale and where I think there are some flaws. And I want to know what you think. What's your analysis, right? So put one of your questions, say hi in the chat box, hit that like button. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start talking. I have to get the screen here, right? All right, so did you know that this is the first time the U.S. Supreme Court has taken away a constitutional right? Yes, this is the first time. First time. And it's approximately 50 years ago that the court established a constitutional right to an abortion. Hi there, Luke. I viewed a number of your videos. Hey, nice. Thank you, Luke. Right on. Hey, I can tell you this much, Luke. Whatever side you're on here, right? Whether you're for abortion or against abortion, there's going to be a big change coming in this country, okay? We can start with the fact that the Constitution says all men are created equal. All men. It doesn't say women, okay? So maybe we're going to be rewriting that Constitution. And think of the bigger picture here. The bigger picture is if in this decision, the Supreme Court has said there's no constitutional right to abortion, and now the states, each state will decide whether or not they will give a woman a right to an abortion, and if they do, what the restrictions will be. Okay, so they are leaving this decision. They're throwing it back on the states. So is that the majority rule? Is the majority going to decide what happens to women's reproductive rights, to women's bodies? It's very interesting. Okay, so let me get to, so go ahead and subscribe. And you need to subscribe if you want to participate in the chat. So please do subscribe and please put some of your questions. So this case, it's called the Dobbs versus Dobbs State Health Officer of Mississippi, Department of Health, versus the Jackson Women's Health Organization. So what happened is an abortion clinic in Mississippi sued the state, the Mississippi state, because they had passed a law that prohibited abortions prohibited abortions after 15 weeks, which is not what Roe says and what's not what Casey says, which is the case law that established an abortion right in the United States. So in that case, the reason it ended up in the Supreme Court is because the lower court affirmed, in other words, did not allow the state to impose this restriction. Then it eventually got appealed, and then it got sent up to the Supreme Court on this question. Here's the question. The question is, can a state impose pre-viability restrictions? In other words, before the pregnancy is viable, can they impose restrictions, and are those restrictions unconstitutional? Because the question was whether Mississippi state law prohibiting the restriction on abortion to no abortions after 15 weeks, which is before the viability, apparently, before the viability time, that was a violation of the Constitution, the abortion rights. That's what the doctor, the abortion clinic, the Jackson Women's Health Organization was arguing. Okay, so today, and you can go ahead and look at the video I did on the leaked draft opinion. And by the way, it's very similar to this published opinion we got today. So the Supreme Court has now ended the constitutional right that women have in the United States for an abortion. And it's now up to the state. It's up to each citizen. It's up to our representatives, or the politicians, to decide what to do with a woman's body. Are we going to have a great migration? Are people going to be moving from state to state? How does this impact low-income women, low-income families? Who decides? Who decides who has control over a woman's reproductive rights? Who decides what happens to, let's face it, her womb, right? And whether that amounts to control, whether it's, a viable control that states and the state governments can impose on women. It's not an easy question. People disagree. People have serious and passionate beliefs in this area. And I'm not here to judge one way or another, but let's get to the opinion, okay? I'll just give you the quick note on the opinion. The opinion written by the majority, right? It's a 5-4 decision, throwing out Roe versus Wade, throwing out the abortion right, throwing it back to the states, letting the states decide what to do around abortion. 5-4 decision, okay? I just want to back up a second. Let me correct that. Justice Robert did not agree to throw out Roe versus Wade. Justice Robert, so he did not join in on the decision, the majority opinion. He decided that he disagreed, and he agreed with the majority, saying that the Mississippi state law was a law that was not in the Constitution, right? But he wasn't going to go as far as throwing out the abortion right that Roe and Casey provide American women, okay? So the question the Supreme Court was asked was a narrow one. Can a state impose restrictions on abortion? Is that constitutional or unconstitutional? Okay. So they are upholding what Mississippi is doing and saying that state law is constitutional because we don't recognize an abortion right in the Constitution. Okay. And why is that? So let me get to their decision. But I want to say a couple things first up. It's now making abortion a political question. It's a political question, right? If each state decides. What's it going to do for voter turnout at the next election? Are we going to be the united or divided states? I mean, what's going to happen here? Women's rights in sports, in being able to use a bathroom, having any privacy rights in prison or any safety rights, safe spaces for women, and now reproductive rights. Okay, big question. Our founding fathers put together that Constitution, the United States Constitution, that provides things such as life and liberty rights, right? Constitutional rights. Many of them disagreed. Many disagreed, but they still came together. They still came together to make a decision to write that document, the U.S. Constitution. Okay? So don't lose hope here. All right? Well, however you stand, right? Each state may be deciding what the rights are, or maybe there's going to be a constitutional amendment. Who knows? All right? So back to what I said earlier. Hit that like button. Put some comments. I'll get there in a second, Luke, to your question. Back to what I said earlier. Women are not mentioned in the Constitution. They're not mentioned. It says all men are created equal, right? We decided through case law, like the Roe case, to say that women are now included in having the equal rights, the liberty of their body, right? Which is basically what Roe said, giving a abortion right subject to a particular period of time when they were no longer allowed to have an abortion, because the state interest of protecting the rights of potential life, they had to balance the state rights, the state's interest in protecting potential life, and balancing against a woman's right to choose, a woman's right to have liberty or bodily autonomy, right? And in the Roe case and the Casey case, they do afford women the abortion right, but it's subject to certain restrictions, right? On how, at what point you can have an abortion or not. All right. So let me see here. The other thing, I have questions. What's going to be the outcome of this decision? Are doctors going to get sued if they give an abortion? Are doctors going to get sued if they do or don't discuss abortion? Will hospitals be sued? Will they be closing clinics, closing healthcare facilities where they, again, I'm looking at all options here. I'm not advocating either side. Will they charge doctors with murder? Because if you look at the cases that's cited in the opinion, they do talk about what happened back in the 1800s when abortion was a crime in the majority of states, right? And the penalties they imposed back then. When at that time, by the way, women didn't have a right to vote and women weren't really recognized in many areas. Okay. Back in 18, it was at 68, or I'll get to it in a second. What impact is it going to have on child support and imposing child support and fathers' rights, right? What impact is this going to have? What about domestic violence and child abuse if women are forced to carry pregnancies to term? What about that? What about the impact on abortion? What about, adoption? What about the impact on the foster care system? What about all of that? Most people who are pro-life sure didn't want to be forced to wear a mask. Well, that's interesting, Tony. Yeah. That has been come up many times in discussions I've had with people. What point does the government have a right to tell you what to do with your body? At what point, right? And in this, right now, the decision has been made that women do not have that right, right? Unless we vote, all that language they kept in this opinion, which I mentioned in the last video I did when I went over the leaked video, and I had some hesitation, with all due respect to the Supreme Court, when they talk about women can fight for these rights. Women can lobby the legislature. Women voter turnout was 55% in the polls in Mississippi. Really? Is it a woman's issue only? There are partners involved, there are husbands involved, there are your family's involved, there's your economic situation. And what about the right for a woman to decide her life? What about that right? Okay, so if I remember something in the leaked opinion said something about there's a bigger demand for babies. Yeah, they do talk about that in the opinion, by the way. The opinion talks about over 1 million women. This is some of the justification that the majority has put in their decision to say that over 1 million women are looking for children. Okay, great. Okay, but I'm saying, and again, I'm playing the devil's advocate here. At what point does the woman's liberty, let me put it this way. At what point does the potential life outweigh and outstrip the rights of a woman's liberty? Okay. So, because there's plenty of parents that want to adopt, will call, yeah. Apparently, SCOTUS can restrict privacy and right to choose, but not gun. Yep, Luke, you nailed it. There is in the dissent, let me get to that. They do talk, just quickly here, they do talk about, if the majority wants all of us to allow them to be neutral. Basically, we're not going to make a decision here. We're going to let you face it. Each one of you states, you're going to have to decide. And what they said in the dissent is that they would not be asking the court to be neutral when it's dealing with gun rights, right? So, there's a lot of question here I have regarding whether the reasoning is really consistent in the majority opinion. Okay, so let's get to the analysis. So let me read it to you, some of the points that I thought were interesting. The Constitution does not confer a right to an abortion. Roe and Casey are overruled by this decision today. And the authority to regulate abortion is returned to the people and their elected representatives. So what is the outcome of that? The outcome of that is that the majority will rule. The majority will be able to impose restrictions on the minority. Would we have same-sex marriage? Would we have biracial relationships? Biracial marriages, which are recognized as a constitutional right? Okay, so the critical question is whether the Constitution confers a right to obtain an abortion. So the reasoning in the majority here is abortion's not mentioned in the Constitution. Well, neither is women, Your Honor. And stare decisis. They talk about looking at prior cases. They're saying because Roe and Casey were wrongly decided, they don't have to rely on precedent, prior cases. But as the dissent points out, there are over 20 cases that have been decided relying on the decision and the reasoning of Roe and Casey. And those cases were upheld. But when we get to this case, suddenly it's thrown out. All right, adopt 2-year-olds. So what I'm saying is more babies, there are less older kids in foster care. Yep. Adopt because parents, there are plenty of parents for babies. Right. But the question is, whose rights control here? Potential life or the woman's rights? Okay, so big question for us to really think about and consider and figure out what to do. Okay, so it's not in the Constitution, so we don't have to recognize it. The prior cases were wrongly decided, so we don't have to look at those. We don't have to look at Roe or Casey or that. And interesting, they say it's not rooted in the tradition. It's not rooted in the history of the United States. The right to an abortion is not rooted in the history of the United States. Well, neither is same-sex marriage. Neither is contraceptives. Neither is biracial marriages. Neither is intimate sexual relations. But those are rights that are recognized under the 14th Amendment and in the Constitution, recognized under the constitutional rights. Okay, interesting. So the other thing that they point out is that, if they're going to rely on the past, whether it's deeply rooted in our history, what was going on at the time that they looked, the court here, their decision talks a lot about what was going on back in 1868. Back, they're looking at really old, they're going way back here. Okay. And at that time in 1868 or whatever it was, I think it's 1868, they're saying that abortion had long been a crime in every state. Well, it's actually the majority of states, right? But what they point out in the dissent, great. But at that time in our history, women's rights were not considered. Women didn't have a right to vote. Women were considered basically property. Okay. So I don't know about that rationale by them. All right. So let's look at, okay. So they talk about, it was 1868. 3/4 of the states had abortion as a crime. And at that time, women had no rights. And so they're basically saying it's not in the Constitution. It's not supported by the history. and there's no precedent. Well, there is precedent. It's Roe and Casey and all those other cases that did recognize an individual right or a constitutional right. All right, so then let me get to Casey. The Casey decision, which was decided on looking at what happened in Roe back in 1973. I think Casey was 1992 or 1997, which, further discussed and ruled on the abortion right and upheld it. And they upheld it under the 14th Amendment, which is the Due Process Clause of the United States Constitution. And what that says is no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Well, what is life if you can't determine it for yourself? You can't make choices for yourself. What is liberty? If your liberty, your freedom to live your life, to make your decisions, whether it's reproductive rights, where you want to work, any of those kind of decisions, what is liberty? And is it equal for men and women? Is this a fair and equal liberty for both? It's an interesting question. In big states another big issue is states wanting to make it illegal. Yeah, that's the whole thing. This case could allow states to prohibit people moving there, to prohibit women from coming to seek abortion. It could put a lot of restrictions. I mean, there needs to be a decision made. We all got to come together on this one and make a decision, right? Whose liberty controls and at what point, all right? Who has the ability to make these decisions? And they talked about overruling Roe and Casey will not upend concrete reliance interests like those that develop in cases involving property and contract rights. So they're saying it's not about contract rights or property rights. Well, I respectfully disagree. If you're able to control what someone does with their body, how is that not controlling their property? I don't know. Maybe I'm off base here, but think about this. Then they talk about in the dissent, makes a question and raises this issue because in the opinion by the majority, they talk about this decision concerns the constitutional right to abortion and no other right. Really? Like I said, if you read the decision, the opinion, I should say, the concurring opinion, the agreeing opinion by Justice Thomas, he basically wants to get rid of the 14th Amendment. Okay, so what happens to biracial marriages, to the right to contraceptives, to all those questions, all those same-sex marriages, what happens to those rights? It's interesting. I don't know if it will impact them or not, but these are big questions. Okay, so they also, and here's another thing, they were not asked in this case. The court was not asked. The Supreme Court was not asked to establish the standard of review. So in other words, if you're going to come and say that your constitutional right is violated, the state has to say that it's a strict scrutiny standard. In other words, the standard that they're applying here is they have now, they're allowing states to decide the abortion issue, but they're also lowering the standard. So if it was a constitutional right, as it was recognized in Roe and Casey, the state had to prove it was called strict scrutiny standard, meaning it was a very high standard they had to achieve to show that the state rights overrule the constitutional rights, right? But now in this decision, and they weren't asked, in this decision, they're telling the states that the standard's lower now. It's a rational review standard, meaning that if the state can come up with any legitimate reason to impose their regulations on abortion or prohibit abortion, it looks like according to this majority, they're okay with that. They lowered the standard because it's no longer a constitutional issue. What do you think about that? Okay, Luke says this won't impact the rich, wealthy women. It will impact the poor, marginalized. Well, I don't know. I don't know about that, Luke. What about the doctors that are treating the rich, wealthy women? What about the hospitals? I don't know. But I can tell you this much: when you don't have liberty, when you don't have the right to make your own choice, and by God, I'm privileged, right? I grew up at this time. I had the ability to make the choices in my life, to go to school, to get educated. And by the way, education's not in the Constitution either. So, I was given that privilege. I was afforded that constitutional right, right? So, what happens here? Are we going to let the majority rule over the minority? I don't know. We'll have to see. So, let me get to see if there's any. Okay. If we leave it up to the majority, and albeit if that's what each state wants to do, if the voters want to do that, that's their prerogative, right? But I think people are going to be moving possibly, but what does it do to other rights that are out there? And I go back to the same-sex marriage, right? Would the majority have voted for that, right? I mean, in some states they did, right? And then it went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. You have to understand that the court is there to protect rights, to impose rights on those that, on those kind of minority decisions, right? They're there to protect and impose rights. So let me get to what they say in the dissent, because it's fascinating, I think. And again, just my opinion, just for education information. All right, so I think education might be a state constitutional, at least in one. Yeah, no kidding. So they talk about, and this is Justice Breyer, Justice Sotomayor, and Justice Kagan were dissenting. These are the three justices dissenting, and Roberts also did not vote to overrule Roe. He didn't want to go that far, okay? So they talk about, for half a century, I think it's 49 years, 50 years, the U.S. Supreme Court has protected the liberty and the equality of women. Is this about equality? Is this about liberty? The government could not control a woman's body or the course of a woman's life. I mean, what is life and what is liberty if it's subject to control by other people, by governments potentially? Roe and Casey well understood the difficulty and the divisiveness around the abortion issue. The court knew that the Americans hold profoundly different views about the morality of terminating a pregnancy. That's why they stepped in, right? They were creating a constitutional right. Okay, so they didn't leave it up to the states. It held that states could prohibit abortions after fetal viability. So there is a balancing test, right? The Supreme Court and the prior decisions of Casey and Roe, they did consider the interest of the potential life, right? They did. They weighed it against the rights of the woman. And they found that, yes, a woman has a right up to a certain point to have an abortion. But now this decision is saying every state out there, you can do what you want as long as the voters, state representatives approve. Okay? Today, the court discards that balance. It says that from the very moment of fertilization, a woman has no rights to speak of. No rights to speak of. A state can force her to bring a pregnancy to term. So who owns your body? And where have we seen this before in history? So a state can, of course, impose criminal penalties on abortion providers, including lengthy prison sentences. Yeah, why can't these states start imposing crimes for assisting in abortion, being involved in abortion, and you go away for 4 years, 6 years? Each state can address abortion as it pleases. The state may block women from traveling out of state to obtain abortions, may criminalize efforts. I mean, this decision has wide implications. And what's to say the federal government can't just step in and prohibit abortions, period, or prohibit them under certain circumstances? Whatever the exact scope of the coming law, one result of today's decision is certain: the curtailment of women's rights and of their status as free and equal citizens. That's what they're saying. This decision curtails a woman's right and their status as free and equal citizens. Right? Does she have autonomy of her body or not? Does she have the right to make decisions? Does she have reproductive rights? Or who tells a woman what to do with her body? The Constitution will today, by today's majority decision, provide no shield despite its guarantees of liberty and equality for all. Really? Liberty and equality for all unless you're pregnant. Is that what that says? It's involving bodily integrity, familial relationships, and procreation. And they also point to the fact that the decision regarding same-sex marriage, regarding biracial relationships, regarding being able to use contraceptives, none of that's rooted in history. None of it. So why is this court relying on that to throw this out? Okay, so the court and here's what they say. The court reverses course today. They throw out, first time in history, they throw out a constitutional right. The court reverses course today for one reason and one reason only: because the composition of the court has changed. It's scathing. This dissent, they're saying, hey, the composition of the court changed, so you guys are now going to go ahead and throw out decisions, throw out constitutional rights, and who knows what's next. And they're saying that the majority relying and saying that Roe and Casey were simply aberrations or decided wrongly. That's not true either, because there were many cases since then, over 20 cases, where the court has upheld the decision, upheld the reasoning. They weren't going through and saying it was wrongly decided. The majority's core legal postulate is that we in the 21st century must read the 14th Amendment just as its ratifiers did. So when they ratified the 14th Amendment back in 18, whenever it was, they said, let me get to it here. People who ratified the 14th Amendment back then, what rights did those people have? No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. No person. So who is the person? What rights did those person or those people have in their hands at that time? But of course, people did not ratify the 14th Amendment. Men did. Because back then it was men who made these decisions, and they're the ones who wrote the Constitution. And they're the ones who forgot to put women in it. Okay, just, trying to lighten it up a little bit here. Okay, so back both in 1868 and when the original Constitution was approved in 1788, it was all men are created equal. And at that time, they didn't recognize women's rights, and they didn't consider the interests of women. So why is this court relying on that as their reasoning? So, the 14th Amendment did not perceive women as equals and did not recognize women's rights. Yeah, back in 1778 and 1886, I'll agree with that. But, this is a whole different time, right? So let me see the questions. All right, so are you saying, okay, sure does. If pro-life people cared about abortions, they wouldn't have thought free birth control. Yeah, no kidding. And that's a big point. And thank you for pointing that out. There is a Supreme Court decision that does recognize your right to contraceptives. But if you get pregnant, you don't have the right, you don't have any say. So why is that a constitutional right, contraceptives, held to a higher standard, but the right to your own bodily autonomy is not? You see what I'm getting at? All right. So let me see here. I thought it was very interesting. They mentioned time travel in the dissent. Check this out. Listen. So apparently the 14th Amendment might provide protection for things wholly unknown in the 19th century, right? Wholly unknown, right? Same-sex marriages, biracial marriages, the right for intimate sexual relations, all those constitutional rights. Who knew about that back in when they wrote the 14th Amendment and wrote the Constitution, right? So apparently the 14th Amendment might provide protection for things wholly unknown in the 19th century. Maybe one day there could be a constitutional protection for, time travel. They actually said this in dissent, right? Even though we can't envision it. And the whole point of it, and if you look at, I think it's Justice White, I'm trying to remember, who wrote this, but the Constitution is a living and breathing document, in my opinion, right? It's supposed to go with the times, right? Yes, people can sue and take cases up to the Supreme Court and let the Supreme Court make a decision whether or not they need to protect women's liberty by finding a constitutional right to an abortion or not. So, but they're talking about time travel. We can't envision time travel, but you have a constitutional right. Maybe it's time travel is a right for liberty, the right to be free to travel. Is that a constitutional right? Could that be a constitutional right? Okay, so, and this is what Luke pointed out, and thank you, Luke, for pointing this out. If you look at this on page 20 of the dissent, they talk about Justice Kavanaugh arguing that the court should basically be neutral. Let the states decide. Let them face this decision. Forget about us protecting, and this is my part, forget about us protecting minority rights here, right? So go ahead and throw it to the states, let the states decide. His idea is that neutrality lies in giving the abortion issue to the states, where some can go one way and some another. But would he say that the court is being scrupulously neutral? The court is being neutral if it allowed New York and California to ban all the guns they want. Do you see how the reasoning may not be consistent here? So, in other words, when it comes to women's rights, we'll let the states decide. But when it comes to guns, oh no, Second Amendment, Supreme Court decides. Is that what he's saying here? What then of the right to contraception or same-sex marriage? Would it be scrupulously neutral for the court to eliminate those rights too? Rather, the court acts neutrally when it protects the rights of all comers, when it protects the rights of minorities. That's, the people that need the protection, right? That's when the court is being neutral. It's being neutral because it's using the law to protect a minority, in this case, an abortion right. It's not taking no position. That's when you want the Supreme Court to step in, when certain people's rights are being violated. Okay. Question is whether it's life or liberty rights. Okay. I'm just not very convinced that the fact that it's not in the Constitution or that it's not, it's not deeply, I'm not really convinced, okay, of the decision by the majority here. In varied cases, the court explained that those choices, the most intimate and personal a person can make, reflect fundamental aspects of personal identity. They define the very attributes of personhood, and they inevitably shape the nature and the future course of a person's life, in this case, a woman's life, and the family, right, is impacted too, and the partner. Okay, in the future course of a person's life. So the court held these choices belong to the individual, not the government. You see, the court is trying to neutralize the playing field by recognizing certain liberty rights here. All right, so it's stepping in, right, and not allowing the government to decide that, but letting the individual to decide it. And then they bring up in the dissent here the whole contraception issue. That wasn't in the Constitution. That's not deeply rooted in our history, but that's a constitutional right. They didn't have any problems with that reasoning. Okay, so They also refer to this as a catastrophic decision. The dissent says that this is a catastrophic decision. As a matter of constitutional substance, the majority's opinion has all the flaws its method would suggest, because laws in 1868 deprived women of any control over their bodies. The majority approves states doing so today. Wow. Today's decision strips women of agency over, when even the majority agrees, is a contested moral issue. So they're stripping the agency of women, even, when it's a contested moral issue. It forces her to carry out the state's will, forces her to carry the pregnancy. Whatever the circumstances and whatever the harm, it will wreak on her and her family. In the 14th Amendment's terms, it takes away her liberty. By overruling Roe and Casey, more than 20 cases reaffirming and applying the constitutional right to abortion, the majority abandoned stare decisis, a principle central to the rule of law. They have abandoned prior case law. They have abandoned it. Stare decisis promotes the even-handed, predictable, and consistent development of legal principles. In other words, the justices look at what's happened in the past. They look at what the decisions were. But in this case, they're just throwing the prior cases out because they were wrongly decided. And it wasn't rooted in history. All right, here it is. To repeat, the point of, this is the part about letting the majority decide the liberty rights of others. To repeat, the point of a right is to shield individual actions and decisions, to protect individual actions and decisions from the vicissitudes of political controversy, to place them beyond the reach of majorities and officials, and to establish them as legal principles to be applied by the courts. However decisive, a right is not at the people's mercy. That's what the dissent is saying. It's not the woman's right, her reproductive rights, her right for liberty and freedom, they're saying is not at people's mercy. It's not a political controversy. But what this decision has done, it's made it a political controversy. Okay, so let me see what else I have here. Any other questions? Because limiting contraceptive count of the pro-life, yep. All right. This decision, it is the right to choose, all right, and to have her liberty. It is to alter her views of herself and her understanding of her place in society as someone with the recognized dignity and the authority to make those choices. Women have relied on Roe and Casey in this way for over 50 years. Many have never known anything else. When Roe and Casey disappear, the loss of power, control, and dignity will be immense, right? Because now women know that their body is subject to a vote. Isn't that what this decision is telling us? If the states get to decide, if politicians get to decide, they say here, power, not reason, is a new currency of this court's decision-making. Power, not logic, not reasoning, power. Power, not reason, is a new currency of this court's decision-making. Scathing rebuke. The abortion right is also embedded in the lives of women, shaping their expectations, influencing their choices about relationships and work, supporting, as all reproductive rights do, their social and economic inequality. Right? So if you have to carry pregnancy to term, what's the next step? You can't work, you have to stay at home, you can't go to college, you can't finish high school. I mean, what does liberty mean? What does life mean? So big questions. These are big questions we have to think about, So to tell you in the decision that was decided by the other justices, Kavanaugh, Thomas, who it was written by Justice Alito. The opinion was written by Alito. So it was Alito, Kavanaugh, Thomas, Comey Barrett, and who am I missing? Who's the other one I'm missing? Somebody help me out here. I forgot who the fifth justice. Well, Roberts he's not overturning Roe, but he is suggesting a reasonable time test, a reasonable opportunity test, meaning that there needs to be some time at which a woman has a right to choose, but he's not going to go as far as throwing out Roe versus Wade. Okay, he didn't go that far, but he still agreed with the opinion, the majority opinion, right, which is upholding Mississippi state law that prohibits women from having an abortion after 15 weeks, which is, I think, which is, again, showing that the state can determine and put restrictions on what was, until today, a constitutional right to an abortion. Okay, so questions. You guys have questions? I hate when people say that the fetus can really become alive because the fetus could become a person that's the next to us. Yeah, well, it's very interesting. These are big questions, and may we live in interesting times. If you haven't noticed, we're living through very interesting times. I mean, who has the right to impose rights on other? Does the government have the right to impose rights and to impose restrictions on your life? Does the federal government have that right? Does your neighbor have that right? Does the, people down the block have that right? Does the mob at the corner have that right to determine what to do with your body? It's a big question here. And to decide and to tell you how you are to live your life or what to do with your womb, it's not, is this a question about equality? Is this a question about freedom and equality for all, or only for certain people? And is it about power? Is it about power and control, as the dissent suggests? Is that what this decision is about? Is it because of the composition of the Supreme Court has changed? That's why we have this opinion. And it's interesting, when these justices are up for nomination, they go through a confirmation hearing, right? And many times they're asked, will you uphold precedent? Will you uphold precedent? Prior cases. What have these justices said? Okay. And is it, is this decision based on their beliefs? Is it based on, I don't know about, all due respect to these justices, I don't know if I agree with this opinion, really, just based on the analytical, the logic of it. I mean, it's not in the Constitution, neither are those other rights. It's not deeply rooted in history, neither are the other constitutional rights. Okay, so, I understand that it's a difficult decision for people to make, who has rights, who doesn't have rights. But these are, life and liberty is no joke. No joke these days. We all know. We all have a clearer understanding now of life and liberty and what needs to be protected, what needs to be negotiated, what needs to be restricted, right? But think about putting this question as a political question. Is Nevada going to be deciding one way? California decides another? There are going to be certain restrictions. How is it going to impact certain classes of women, right? Not able to travel. You can't afford that kind of medical care. Think about what happened before Roe and Casey became law. What happened to the lives of women then? This is significant, a significant decision. All right, so let me see. It's okay. And if you never know whether the fetus, okay. So any questions? Any questions, you guys? Let me see what else I wanted to say. I have to look at my notes. It's Friday. Yeah, big questions. There's nothing in this decision, in the decision by the majority, that prohibits the state from doing whatever it wants. It's certainly lowered the standard of a constitutional challenge, or I should say not a constitutional challenge, but a review of the law. It's now lowered it to rational review. So the state can show any legitimate reason to impose restrictions or to outright abolish abortion. Sounds like that's good with them, with the majority. But it used to be they had to show that there was an overriding interest, a strict scrutiny. It was a much higher standard when you mess with constitutional rights, like an abortion right was. All right. So, yeah, what a week, Catherine. No kidding. Fasten your seatbelts. I'm sure there's more to come. More to come. But you know what? I think about the long term. The Constitution, the document, reading it, all men are created equal. Maybe it's time we take a look at the Constitution and maybe we include people in there. And that includes men and women, right? That includes a lot of people. Maybe we sit down and we think about, what does life mean to you? What does life mean to your neighbor? What does liberty mean? Who has the rights to impose what restrictions, what regulations on another group of people? Right? But is this consistent? If we uphold the right to contraceptives, we uphold the right to marry whoever you want, but yet a woman does not have the right to make choices that impact her life and impact her economic situation? I don't know. It's a tough one. It's a tough one for people. It is a moral question, definitely, but it's also a legal question. And it's also a fundamental question, right? Do we give life and liberty to certain people and not to other people? All right. Do you know the leaked opinion quoted a man that, yeah, I don't know about that. I don't know about the leaked opinion. I haven't heard how it was leaked or what happened. But I can tell you this much. I'm sure this decision, there's a lot of interesting conversations going on today. No doubt. And I'm sure this is going to impact voter turnout. I'm sure, women and those who love women are going to be asking some big questions here. And, they tried for many years to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed. Maybe this leads to a constitutional amendment. Maybe this leads to rewriting the Constitution. What does life and liberty for all mean to you? Does that mean it only applies to certain people? What does bodily autonomy mean to you? What rights does the government have over you and your body? Big questions. That's why we have a judicial system like we have, where the Supreme Court is the final word. But it looks at what happened in the lower courts, at the Court of Appeal, and what happens at the trial courts. Has the defendant's right to a fair trial been violated? Has the defendant's Fifth Amendment rights been violated, compelled to testify? Has, a woman's right to an abortion been impacted? All of those things. Has it been restricted? What does the law say? Well, apparently today, the Constitution does not protect a woman's right to an abortion. So I think it's interesting. And what does life and liberty mean to each one of us? And what rights do we afford our neighbors? And what rights do we afford the government to restrict? And for what reasons? I mean, it's all hands on deck now, if you haven't noticed. All hands on deck. We need to decide what this country, who are we, and where are we going, right? And who has the power and control over certain people, and who doesn't? These are big, weighty questions. As I said earlier, we're definitely living in interesting times. Okay, so any states' rights, abortion is up to each state. Yeah, it is. But how come gun rights aren't? How come? What is that? What is the big impact? What is it? Look at the big picture here. Yeah, each state can decide But what about women who can't travel to another state? Or what about women who are restricted from leaving a state? That imposes burdens on certain people and not on others. You see what I'm getting at? And why do you have a constitutional right to have a gun or contraceptives, but you don't have a right to determine your own life? Is that what this decision is saying? Is that what the states are going to be deciding? Are we going to be leaving this decision up to politicians and up to whether or not people vote? And I bet you people are going to be turning out to vote, and people, I'm sure, are going to get active. And maybe that's the good thing. If there's a good thing in this decision, it's going to wake people up to decide, what does that Constitution mean to you? What does life mean to you? What does liberty mean to you? What is the government? What role does the government play in your life or not play in your life? These are big questions. And now's the time, apparently, because we've just been given notice that this Supreme Court, the majority of the court, has told us, you guys go figure it out. You need to face that question. You need to face and you need to decide the abortion issue. We're going to be neutral. We're not going to step in and protect anybody. We're going to let each one of your states decide. And if each states decide, are we going to be like forum shopping where we live? We go to certain states because, so what happened to the United States? I mean, do you see what I'm getting at? Are we United States? Are we going back to where we were the colonies, and each colony had its own rules, and then we came together because we decided under the Constitution that we would all live under these rights, and we would give the court, the Supreme Court, the final say. We would put our trust in those justices to decide with their wisdom and with their knowledge, to decide and to reason what the decision should be, and whether or not, in this case, the decision to uphold the woman's right to an abortion, they apparently don't agree. They don't agree. Not rooted in history, not in the Constitution. I don't think that's controlling, with all due respect. Was the decision flawed? Well, I wonder if it's about power and control, as the dissent says, over certain populations, certain reproductive rights. I mean, look at the big picture of what's going on here. Big picture. What other things are impacting women's rights? So, we got big questions to think about and big answers to come up with. Okay, so any other questions? Again, these are not easy questions, and we can all disagree. We can all have different opinions. But listening and having respect is what we need now, right? Just like what our founding fathers, they fought like heck over things. But they came together to decide and to birth this country, okay? So who are we now? What rights are we going to afford? We've had, in my opinion, I think we've had enough separation. So I think there can be compromises, and I think this is an opportunity for us to really ask those questions and to think about why we take a position one way or another, and whether we can find ways to move forward together. Okay, so I don't have anything else to say. Do you guys have any other comments? Any thoughts? Hit that like button. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to put, if you want to contribute to supporting, if you want to do a super chat, I'll put it in the description box below the video. I want to say thank you to all of you for joining me on this such late notice. And I tried to read through the 213 pages of the opinion. I did read it, and I pointed out some things that I thought were interesting. The Supremes give us quite a lot to talk about this summer. Yeah. And by the way, you do know the Supreme Court, they have lifetime appointments. I think treason has to be proven to remove a Supreme Court justice. And I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm just trying to fill you in on how the system works. But these are weighty questions about who has liberty, what's equality, who has the decision, who has the right to decide how you live, what you do with your body, what the government can impose or not impose. And, voting is definitely important, definitely. And change is important too. And I don't throw shade on the Supreme Court for revisiting those cases. I just don't agree with the reasoning. I don't think it's consistent based on other cases because it looks like they're cherry picking, right? We'll approve contraception, but we won't abortion. We'll approve same sex, but we won't abortion. And if you read the decision, they don't talk about the impact on women's rights at all. They don't talk about it. They don't talk about the cost. So again, just my opinion. All right, Paul Smith, who argued the guns rights before it goes, just got canned from, oh, that's interesting. Well, there's a lot of stuff going on these days. A lot of stuff going on. And I'm not one for cancel culture. I think people should have the right to their opinion, just like this court does. But it doesn't give us a pass, right? I think, as I said earlier, I think we've had enough separation. And I think it's time that we come together and figure out what rights each of us has. Is it equal or not? And if it's not, then so be it. But, I encourage you to read the Constitution. It's an amazing document. To read the U.S. Constitution, to read the Bill of Rights. It's amazing, amazing. And what I've tried to do in these videos is to teach you, about the Fifth Amendment, right to remain silent. The Sixth Amendment, right to counsel. The Fourth Amendment, no unreasonable search and seizure, right? The 14th Amendment, the due process. Can't be, no person, it doesn't say no women or no men, it says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And it also comes down to how much do you want the government involved in your life? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But those are questions that we're all going to be deciding, right? We're on this planet, one planet, and we're here now. So these are the questions. These are big questions for us to decide. Okay. He had argued over Henry Chris. Yeah. Yep. Lots of stuff is going on. That's a good comment, Catherine. Thank you for that. So again, I just want to close out. I know it's Friday night. You probably got more important things to do. So I want to say thank you very much to all of you for subscribing and being such loyal supporters of my channel. And do hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you at the next video and enjoy your weekend.